Hello students, welcome to this lecture on the course Principles of Political Science. Today's lecture is on empirical method in political science, meaning and features. We have already discussed the normative method. Now we turn to a second and equally important method, and that is empirical method. The empirical method represents a fundamentally different way of studying politics, where the normative methods asks what ought to be. The empirical method asks what is. It focuses on observable facts, evidence, data, and the systematic observation of political phenomena rather than on values or ideals. Here is our agenda for today. We'll define the empirical method and examine its nature and key features. We'll trace its historical development, particularly the rise of behavioralism in the 20th century. We'll study key thinkers, including David Easton and Harold Lasswell. We'll examine the importance of the empirical method, the techniques it uses, and its application in political science. The empirical method in political science is defined as the approach that studies political phenomena through systematic observation, collection of factual data, and evidence-based analysis. The word empirical comes from the ancient word empiria, meaning experience or experiment. The empirical method, therefore, is based on direct experience, on what can actually be observed, measured, and tested in the real world. Unlike the normative method, which derives its conclusion from philosophical reasoning about values and ideals, the empirical method derives its conclusions from evidence. It starts with the question, what actually happens in political life? What do voters actually do? How the governments actually make decisions? What policies actually produce what outcomes? These questions are answered not by philosophical arguments, but by systematic observation of political reality. The empirical method treats political science as a science in the same sense that physics, chemistry, or biology is a science, one that builds knowledge through observation, hypothesis formation, testing, and verification. This scientific aspiration is what distinguishes the empirical approach from the normative tradition that preceded it. In everyday language, we use the word empirical to mean based on evidence rather than on theory or assumption. An empirical claim is one that can be tested against reality. These questions are answered not by philosophical argument, but by systematic observation of political reality. The empirical method treats political science as a science in the same sense that physics, chemistry, or biology is a science, one that builds knowledge through observation, hypothesis formation, testing, and verification. The scientific aspiration is what distinguishes the empirical approach from the normative tradition that preceded it. In everyday language, we use the word empirical to mean based on evidence rather than on theory or assumption. An empirical claim is one that can be tested against reality. The empirical method is by nature a scientific and objective approach to studying politics. Its fundamental commitment is to objectivity, to studying political phenomena as they are without allowing the personal values, ideological preferences, or moral commitments of the researcher to distort the findings. The commitment to objectivity distinguishes the empirical method most sharply from the normative approach. The empirical method is based on evidence. Every claim or conclusion in empirical political science must be grounded in observable evidence that others can independently verify. This requirement of verifiability is central to the scientific character of the empirical approach. If a claim cannot be tested against observable evidences, if there is no way in principle to determine whether it is true or false, then it falls outside the domain of empirical inquiry. The empirical method is also systematic. It does not rely on casual observation or anecdotes, but on carefully designed procedures for collecting and analyzing data. These procedures, whether they involve survey research, experimental design, statistical analysis, or comparative case studies, are designed to minimize the distorting effects of research bias or researchers' bias, sampling error, and other sources of error. The empirical method is also cumulative. The empirical method has several key features that define and distinguish it as an approach to political science. The first and most fundamental is observation, the systematic, direct examination of political phenomena as they occur in the real world. Empirical political scientists observe elections, legislative proceedings, government decision making, protest movements, public opinion formation, and many other political processes. This observation is not casual or impressionistic. It is structured, purposeful, and governed by explicit methodological protocols. Observation can take several forms. Direct observation involves watching political events and recording what happens, attending legislative sessions. Indirect observations involves studying the records, documents, and traces left by political events. Hansard's transcripts, government documents, newspaper archives, and administrative records. Structured observation involves applying a predetermined coding scheme to what is observed. For example, coding the content of political speeches or the voting behavior of legislators. The second feature is data collection, the systematic gathering of information about political phenomena. Data in empirical political science can take many forms: survey responses from voters, demographic records from census survey, voting records from election commissions, legislative voting data, economic indicators from government agencies, and content of political communication. The third key feature of the empirical method is verification, the systematic testing of claims and hypotheses against evidence. In empirical political science, a researcher does not simply assert that a particular relationship exists between two political variables. They design a research procedure to test whether the relationship actually holds when examined against the real world data. Verification proceeds through hypothesis testing. A hypothesis is a specific testable claim about a relationship between two or more variables. For example, states with higher levels of literacy have higher voter turnout. This hypothesis makes a specific testable prediction. It can be examined by collecting data on literacy rates and voter turnout across Indian state and statistically analyzing whether the predicted relationship holds. Hypotheses that are supported by evidence gain credibility. Those that are contradicted by evidence are revised or rejected. Over time, through many rounds of hypothesis testing and verification, empirical political science builds a body of reliable evidence-based knowledge about political phenomena. The fourth feature is objectivity, the commitment to minimizing the influence of personal bias, ideology, and values on the research processes and its conclusions. Procedural safeguards, transparency, peer review, replication, and separation of findings from normative evaluation helps reduce bias and make empirical findings as reliable and objective as possible. The fifth key feature of the empirical method is its commitment to systematic and rigorous methodology. Empirical research in political science must follow clearly defined and transparent procedures that allow other researchers to understand exactly how data was collected, how variables were measured, and how conclusions were reached. This methodological transparency is what allows the scientific community to evaluate, criticize, replicate, and build on each other's work. The sixth feature is generalizability, the aspiration that empirical findings should not merely describe specific cases but should identify general patterns and relationships that hold across multiple cases. If a study finds that economic decline increases support for authoritarian politicians in one country at one point in time, the empirical researcher asks whether this relationship holds more generally across other countries, other time periods, and different types of economic distress. The seventh feature is value neutrality in the research process. Empirical political scientists typically maintain a distinction between their roles as researchers who describe and explain political phenomena objectively and their role as citizens who may have strong personal values and political commitments. In their research, they aim to set aside their values and follow the evidence wherever it leads. The empirical method did not develop suddenly. It emerged gradually over several centuries as part of a broader intellectual movement that sought to apply scientific methods to the study of human society. Its roots can be traced to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which transformed the study of the natural world through systematic observation and experimentation. Thinkers like Francis Bacon argued that knowledge should be built from observation and experience rather than knowledge should built rather than from philosophical reasoning alone. Bacon's empiricist philosophy provides one of the intellectual foundations of the modern empirical tradition. In the 19th century, thinkers like Auguste Comte, who coined the term sociology, argued that the same scientific methods that had proved so successful in studying the natural world should be extended to the study of human societies and social sciences as well. Comte's positivism held that only statements that could be empirically verified were scientifically meaningful. This positivist philosophy deeply influenced the development of the social science, including political science. However, the most decisive movement in the development of the empirical methods in political science specifically was the behavioral revolution of the mid-20th century. The behavioral revolution, which began in United States in the 1950s, represented a fundamental shift in how political science understood itself as a discipline. The behavioral revolution in political science reached its height in the 1950s and 60s and was associated with several influential scholars. David Easton, one of the most important figures in this movement, published The Political System in 1953, in which he argued that political science needed to develop a systematic and scientific framework for studying politics. Easton's most influential contribution was the systems framework, the conceptualization of political system as a mechanism that converts inputs that are demands and supports from the society into outputs that are policies and decisions. This framework provided a way of studying political phenomenon empirically and systematically, focusing on observable processes rather than on normative ideals. Easton called for a political science of the future that would be genuinely scientific, building knowledge through systematic observation and empirical testing rather than through philosophical speculation. Easton later became a critic of what he called the hyperfactualism of behavioralism, the tendency to collect data without adequate theoretical reflection. He argued that empirical research needs to be guided by theory. It is to produce meaningful results. His critique anticipated what he called the post-behavioral revolution, a call for political science to maintain its scientific rigor while also paying attention to the relevance of its findings for solving real political problems. Harold Laswell is another major figure in the development of the empirical approach in political science. Born in 1902 and dying in 1978, Laswell was one of the most creative and wide-ranging political scientists of the 20th century. He made pioneering contributions to the empirical study of political psychology, propaganda, power, and public policy, drawing on psychology, sociology, and communications theory to build an empirical understanding of political behavior. Laswell's most famous formulation is his definition of politics as the study of who gets what, when, and how. A definition that oriented political science towards empirical study of power and resource distribution rather than towards normative questions about what political arrangements ought to be. This formulation, introduced in the 1936 in his 1936 work, Politics: Who Gets What, When, When and How, had a profound influence on how political scientists thought about their subject and reinforced the empirical turn in the discipline. Laswell also made major contributions to the study of propaganda, the systematic use of communication to influence political opinion. His book, Propaganda Techniques in the World War, published in 1927, was one of the first systematic empirical analysis of how governments use communication to mobilize public support during wartime. Beyond Easton and Laswell, the behavioral revolution in political science was shaped by a wide range of scholars who applied empirical methods to specific areas of political inquiry. Robert Dahl, in A Preference to Democratic Theory, published in 1956, used empirical analysis to challenge the prevailing normative assumptions about democracy. Rather than defining democracy in terms of ideal principles, Dahl sought to describe what democratic systems actually look like in practice, who actually hold power, how decisions are actually made, and what conditions are necessary for democratic politics to function. Dahl's concept of polyarchy, ruled by many rather than by a single sovereign, was an attempt to describe actually existing democracies empirically. His later work, Who Governs, published in 1961, studied the distribution of power in New Haven, Connecticut, through systematic empirical research involving interviews, observations of decision making, and analysis of community records. This study became a landmark of the empirical political sociology. Gabriel Alman and Sidney Verba, in The Civic Culture, published in 1963, conducted one of its major cross-cultural empirical surveys of political attitudes and behavior in 5 countries: United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and Mexico. The empirical method is of great importance to political science for several reasons. The first is that it makes political science more rigorous and scientific by insisting that claims about political phenomena be grounded in verifiable evidence rather than in philosophical speculation or ideological assertion. The empirical method raises the standards of knowledge in the discipline and makes it possible to distinguish better supported from less supported claims. Before the empirical method became established, political scientists often relied on intuition, anecdotes, and philosophical arguments to support their claims about how political systems work. The empirical method replaced these unreliable foundations with the systematic observation and quantitative analysis. This transformation made political science more credible as a discipline and enabled it to contribute more effectively to the practical problems of governance and policy making. The second reason is that the empirical method enables political science to make meaningful contributions to policy analysis and policy making. Governments and public institutions need evidence-based analysis to design and evaluate policies. Empirical political science provides exactly this kind of analysis. It studies how policies are actually implemented, what their actual effects are, and how they can be improved in India. Empirical political science has contributed, has contributed to understanding electoral politics, the effects of reservation on representation, and the link between economic development and democracy. A third major reason for the importance of empirical method is that it enables researcher to identify causal relationships in political life, to determine not merely that two phenomena are associated, but that one actually causes the other. Understanding causation is essential for effective policy making. If we know that a particular intervention causes a particular outcome, we can design policies with confidence. If we only know that two things are correlated, we cannot be sure that changing one will change the other. For example, empirical research has found a correlation between education and democratic attitudes. But is this correlation causal? Does education cause people to support democracy, or do democratic societies invest more in education, or is some third factor responsible for both? Answering this question requires the sophisticated causal interference method that empirical political scientists have developed, including natural experiments, instrumental variables, regression discontinuity designs, and randomized controlled trials. The fourth reason is that the empirical method makes political science cumulative. It allows researchers to build on each other's work and gradually develop a more complete and reliable understanding of political phenomena. Because empirical findings are expressed, in precise, testable terms and backed by transparent data and methods, other researchers can replicate and extend them. The empirical method employs a variety of specific techniques. The first and most widely used technique in modern empirical political science is survey research, the systematic collection of information from a representative sample of a population through structured questionnaires. Survey allows the researcher to study the political attitudes, beliefs, preferences, and behaviors of large populations at a relatively low cost. In India, surveys have been used extensively to study voting behavior, political attitudes, and public opinion. The National Election Studies conducted by the Lok Niti program at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies have surveyed tens of thousands of Indian voters across multiple election cycles since 1996. These surveys have produced systematic representative data on how Indians vote, why they vote as they do, and how their political attitudes vary across regions, caste, religions, genders, and economic groups. The pre-election surveys conducted by major polling organizations, including those published before Indian parliamentary and state assemblies elections, are commercial applications of the same survey research methodology used in academic political science. While the accuracy of these surveys varies, they represent an attempt to measure public opinion empirically before elections takes place. The second major technique is case study, an in-depth investigation of a single case or a small number of cases to understand political phenomena in their full complexity and context. While surveys provide breadth information about many cases simultaneously, case studies provides depth, allowing researcher to understand the specific mechanisms, process, and contextual factors that shape political outcomes in particular settings. Case studies are particularly valuable in political science for studying political processes that cannot easily be quantified or studied through surveys. The internal dynamics of coalition government formation, the political economy of a specific economic reform, the decision-making process in a foreign policy crisis, or the social mechanisms of electoral mobilization in a particular constituency. All of these are examples of phenomena that lend themselves to case study research. A well-designed case study select its case theoretically. choosing a case because it is particularly informative about a theoretical question, not merely because it is convenient or interesting. The case study researcher uses multiple sources of evidences like interviews, documents, observation, and archival records to build a comprehensive and triangulated account of the phenomena under study. Myron Weiner's Party Building into a New Nation is a landmark case study of India's political development using empirical methods. The third major technique is statistical analysis, the use of mathematical tools to identify patterns, relationships, and causal effects in political data. Statistical analysis allows a researcher to study large data sets involving many cases and many variables simultaneously to control for confounding actors and to estimate the magnitude and significance of relationship between variables. Basic statistical techniques that are used in empirical political science includes descriptive statistics, measures of central tendency, dispersion that summarizes the characteristics of a data set, and inferential statistics, which allow researcher to draw conclusions about population from sample data. More advanced techniques include regression analysis, which models the relationship between a dependent variable and one or more independent variables while controlling for the effects of other variables. Statistical analysis is particularly important in the study of elections and electoral behavior. Ecological inferences, the statistical estimation of how different demographic groups voted from aggregate constituency level data has been used extensively to understand voting patterns in India. Alistair Macmillan and other scholars have used statistical analysis to study the relationship between candidate characteristics, constituency, demographies, and electoral outcomes in Indian elections. Survey experiments in which respondents are randomly assigned to different conditions and their responses compared have emerged as a powerful tool for studying the effects of political messaging, candidate attributes, and policy information in individual attitudes and decision making. We have already introduced the distinction between the empirical and normative. At this point, we have studied empirical in great depth. Now, let us see the most fundamental difference in between the two is in their orientation. The normative method asks what ought to be. It is prescriptive and evaluative. The empirical method asks what is. It is descriptive and analytical. These different orientations lead to entirely different research questions, methods, and standard of evidence. Second difference is their basis of knowledge. The normative method builds knowledge through philosophical reasoning, conceptual analysis, and ethical argument. The empirical method builds knowledge through observation, data collection, hypothesis testing, and statistical analysis. The third difference is their relationship to value. The normative methods place values at the center of political inquiry. Justice, liberty, equality, and rights are its primary subject matter. The empirical method aims to study politics objectively, setting aside the researcher's own values and following the evidence wherever it leads. However, it is crucial to note that the empirical and normative methods are not simply opposite that compete to replace each other. They are complementary approaches that address different kind of questions. Empirical method has a wide range of application in political science. The most prominent is the empirical study of the elections and voting behaviors. The elections are the central institutions of democratic politics, and understanding how they work, who votes, why they vote as they do, and what factors determine electoral outcomes is one of the most important questions in political science. Besides the empirical study of public opinion, what citizens believe about political issues, their trust in political institutions, and their satisfaction with the government performance is a second important application. Public opinion research in India has documented regional, caste, and gender variations in political trust and satisfaction, evidence about the social basis of democratic engagement. Policy research is the third major application of the empirical method in political science. Policy research uses empirical method to study how public policies are designed, implemented, and evaluated. It asks what factors determine which policies government adopt. Are policies achieving their desired objective or intended objective? What are these unintended consequences of specific policies? How can policies be improved? Impact evaluation is a particularly important form of policy research that seeks to determine whether a specific policy or program has caused the outcomes it was intended to produce. The Poverty Action Lab, JPAL at MIT, has conducted numerous randomized evaluations of social programs in India, including studies of the effects of different teaching methods on students' learning outcomes, the impact of information provision on voting behavior, and the effectiveness of health workers training programs. These studies exemplify the application of rigorous empirical methods to practical policy questions with significant real world consequences. Comparative politics, the systematic comparison of political systems across countries, is a fourth major application. Despite its great strength, there are a number of limitations regarding this method. The first and foremost is that it tends to exclude values from political inquiry, reducing politics to a set of observable facts and measurable variables. By excluding normative analysis from its domain, the empirical method can give us a technically detailed but morally thin account of political life. It can tell us what happens, but not whether it should happen. It can identify effective policies, but not whether those policies are just or not just. Empirical method requires data, and in practice, political scientists can only study what can be measured. We have now completed our lecture. Let us consolidate our understanding and the key takeaways from this lecture. We began by linking this lecture to lecture 11, where we studied the normative method. Then today's transition from normative to empirical is one of the most important intellectual transition in the history of political science. We define the empirical method as the approach that studies political phenomena through systematic observation, data collection, and evidence-based analysis. We examined its nature: scientific, objective, evidence-based, and systematic, and its 7 key features: observation, data collection, verification, objectivity, methodological rigor, generalizability, and value neutrality. In research, we traced its historical development through scientific revolutions, the positivist tradition, and the behavioral revolutions of 50s and 60s. Studied 3 key figures: David Easton and his systems framework, Harold Laswell and his definition of politics, and Robert Dell and his empirical theory of democracy and oligarchy. Thank you.